Tervetuloa tähän YAPSin Q&A-sarjaan, jossa käsittelemme Israelin ja palestiinalaisten välisen konfliktin vaikeita kysymyksiä. Tavoitteenamme on tuoda kuulluksi niiden asiantuntijoiden ääniä, joita harvemmin kuullaan suomalaisessa mediassa, ja sillä tavoin monipuolistaa käsitystä alueen tapahtumista. Tänään aiheenamme on Sheikh Jarrahin palestiinalaisperheiden häädöt, joita on väitetty 1,5 viikkoa sitten päättyneen Hamasin ja Israelin välisen konfliktin yhdeksi syyksi, ja yleensäkin väitteet palestiinalaisten kotien anastamisesta tai tuhoamisesta Itä-Jerusalemissa ja Länsirannalla. Meillä on tänään vieraana Regavim-järjestöstä Naomi Linder Kahn. Regavim on israelilainen kansalaisjärjestö, joka tarkkailee, tutkii ja dokumentoi maankäyttöä Israelissa ja Länsirannalla. Se myös vie oikeuteen tarpeen mukaan laitonta rakentamista, maan anastamista ja luonnonvarojen väärinkäyttöä alueella. Se kerää informaatiota paikan päällä kenttätyönä ja analysoi kerättyä dataa muun muassa turvallisuuden, omaisuuslakien ja historiallisten faktojen kannalta. Naomi Linder Kahn on Regavimin kansainvälisen osaston johtaja. Hänellä on tutkinnot politiikan tutkimuksesta ja Lähi-idän kielten ja kirjallisuuden tutkimuksesta. Naomi, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for giving your time and expertise to answer our questions. So now about Sheikh Jarrah and the background for the recent conflict. It is said that it originated from the threat of eviction of Arab families in the Sheikh Jarrah area in East Jerusalem. Can you tell us what is the situation in Sheikh Jarrah and what is the dispute about? Starting from the basics, like how big the area is, how many flats or houses, or how many people it affects.
Well, those are actually very important questions. The background is really the key to understanding what is and isn't actually happening there. So I'm glad that we have an opportunity to discuss that background. Before we go any further, it just should be stressed that the entire issue involves 6 families. 2 of those families have absolutely no property rights whatsoever. They have never held leases. They have been squatting in properties owned by Jewish landlords for decades. The other 4 families actually have been renters. So altogether, according to Peace Now, which has a tendency, let us say, to exaggerate on the in favor of the Palestinian narrative, according to Peace Now, 31 people are involved. And they lump together both those who have some sort of tenant rights and those who don't. So altogether, we're talking about a small number of people. That does not reduce from the seriousness of the charges. And I'd like to give some more background about exactly what is and what isn't happening there in terms of the legal situation. But first, let's take a very brief history lesson about the area. The Sheikh Jarrah section of Jerusalem actually has 2 names, as do so many of the places here in Israel that you read about in the news. Sheikh Jarrah is the name. This section is known, has been known for 150 years at least, by Jewish residents there as the Simon the Just neighborhood. Simon the Just was a Talmudic scholar going back to the time of the Second Temple. His tomb is in this neighborhood. He was considered a very righteous and holy person. And so the area surrounding his tomb was very, very much sought after by Jews who wanted to live in that vicinity. So I'm just looking at the date, I believe that it was purchased, yes, the Jewish community purchased land around the tomb of Simon the Just from Arab owners in 1876. And they split the neighborhood into 2 sections. One section was built up almost immediately, to the point that until the 1930s, there were hundreds of Jewish residents in that area. As a matter of fact, in yesterday's Arutz Sheva Israel National News daily newspaper, there was a very interesting article about someone who was born there and whose grandparents were born there, and just a personal view of the situation there. But this neighborhood is actually known for 2 reasons to most Jewish Jewish people and Israelis in particular. One, again, is because of the tomb of Simon the Just, and the other is much more modern history, and that is the massacre in April 1948 of a convoy of medical staff and patients that was going to the Mount Scopus Hadassah Hospital, and the residents of Sheikh Jarrah massacred the entire convoy. They killed 78 people, doctors, nurses, and patients, right outside the headquarters of the British Army, who was stationed right there, the Shepherd Hotel. And the British did nothing to intervene, and the entire convoy was massacred. So this area has unfortunately always been a flashpoint because of its location and its desirability, and because it has been a major area of Jewish communal life for hundreds of years. So what happened more recently? After the massacre in April 1948, in June 1948, as everyone knows, the State of Israel was declared, and the Jordanians illegally occupied and then eventually annexed parts of what had originally been set aside as the Jewish State of Israel. They renamed this area the West Bank, even though it is on the eastern edge of the State of Israel, in order to justify their actual occupation and annexation of the area. And they did what generally countries do in the aftermath of a war, what the British mandate had also done, and that is to appoint a custodian, the custodian for abandoned enemy property. So the custodian took control of both Jewish and Israeli Arab-owned land in the areas that it had occupied and annexed. Because all of those people, both the Jews and the Arabs, were now citizens of what they considered an enemy country, the custodian took control of those properties. In many of the cases, in most cases, as a matter of fact, the Jordanian custodian canceled the ownership, certainly all Jewish ownership, because according to Jordanian law, which is still on the books and still in force in these areas, according to Jordanian law, Jews are not permitted to own property in any of these areas. So essentially the Jordanian government, that's true of all of Jordan, as a matter of fact, and in what is now considered the West Bank, Jews are not permitted to own property. So the Jordanian custodian canceled out ownership of most of the properties and used it to build government buildings, or to house refugees, various other things. In some cases, Arab landowners were given compensation, or compensation was held in escrow for them, and they could make compensation claims. But in general, there was no such thing, and there still is no such thing really, as the right of return. In any of the cases where Jewish ownership was canceled, that ownership was canceled in perpetuity. That means that in 1967, when Israel regained control of these areas, it adopted all of the decisions that had been made, all of the transfers of title that had been made by the Jordanian custodian, recognizing that Jewish land rights had been canceled. The Jews have no way, the Jewish owners of these properties had no way and still have no way of reclaiming those rights. However, here's where it becomes interesting. The land that, Jewish land that was owned, for example, I'll just give you one very interesting detail here, which will illustrate the rest of the problem. Some of the Jewish land that was taken by the custodian and for which Jewish rights were canceled was used to create refugee camps, as I mentioned. So the Dehesha refugee camp outside Jerusalem, in the Gush Etzion area, the Kalandia refugee camp, the Anata refugee camp are all built either entirely or in a majority on land that was owned by Jews before 1948. And the Jordanian custodian simply canceled their ownership rights, and that land is now lost to the original Jewish owners. However, in the case of Sheikh Jarrah, the Simon the Just area, the Jordanian custodian did not cancel those property rights of the original Jewish owners. What it did instead was came to an agreement with the United Nations Refugee Works Association, UNRWA, to build housing for some 28 refugee families on this land. It did not cancel the ownership, it simply leased the land. The custodian leased the land to the Jordanian Ministry of Development, and the Ministry of Development came to an agreement with UNRWA that funded the construction of housing units for refugees on this Jewish-owned land. When Israel resumed control of these areas, the owners went back to court and proved their ownership, which had never been disputed, and said the people who are living there can continue to live there, but they have to pay rent. Just as they paid rent during the Jordanian occupation, they have to pay rent now to the owners. And actually, one of the principal conditions for being allowed to live there that the Jordanians had was that they paid rent. So they were never given title to these properties. The Jewish ownership was never canceled, and these people were renters. So being renters to either the Jordanians or now back to the original Jewish owners. And the Jewish owners never attempted to have these people evicted. They went to court to have them pay rent, which is reasonable. At a certain point in 1982, I believe, I can check that for you. I can check that if anyone's, yes, in 1982, the owners actually reached an agreement in court with the representative, the lawyer representing the families who were living there, in which the families living in their properties agreed to pay rent and would be given special protected tenant status, which happens in some of the older structures in Jerusalem. That those rights, the protected tenant rights, can be passed down from father to son within families. So they can't be evicted, they're protected tenants, and they have to pay rent. And that agreement was signed and everything was fine until after a certain amount of time, the Palestinian Authority began to exert pressure on these tenants. And they revoked their agreement. They simply said, we're rescinding our agreement, we no longer agree. And they went back to court time and time again in order to try to prove some sort of rights they claim, but have never shown any proof that they were given title to these properties during the Jordanian occupation. But of course, that makes no sense, because if they were given leases as renters and they were paying rent, then they obviously weren't given ownership rights. So that's where the situation stands right now. Now, it's important to stress that despite what many newspaper articles and many anti-Israel voices are claiming, the state of Israel is not involved in the case of Sheikh Jarrah. This is a very simple case of tenants and landlords in dispute over rent. The state of Israel is not trying to evict anyone. Even the owners of the properties aren't trying to evict anyone. They simply want rent paid for their property. So this is the case, and you'll hear that this is part of a much larger plan of evictions and ethnic cleansing, and it's nothing of the kind. This is a civil dispute between landowners, landlords, and tenants. And again, even as recently as 1982, when the lawyer representing the Arab tenants went to court, they never disputed the Jewish owners' rights to this property. Yeah. So recent claims to the contrary are obviously politically motivated, and this has been blown out of all proportion, obviously for political reasons. That's some background.
Yeah. Recently, a professor at the University of Tampere wrote in the newspaper that, and this is a quote, Palestinian families have already lost their homes in several districts like Silvan, Wadi al-Jos, as well as in the old town of Jerusalem. And another quote, according to the Israeli human rights organization, Baseless, Israel is systematically seeking to evict Palestinians from the East Jerusalem area through expropriation of land and restrictions on construction, movement, and trade. Would you like to answer these claims? Has Israel been evicting Palestinian families from their homes in East Jerusalem? And is Israel really trying to ethnically cleanse East Jerusalem from Palestinian Arabs? by restricting construction movement and trade, as she and many others claim?
In a word, this is preposterous. I will say it's very, very simple for people to educate themselves. If you go onto the Central Bureau of Statistics website and just have a look, what is the population? The Arab population of Jerusalem is growing at a faster rate than the Jewish population of Jerusalem. If Israel were really attempting to ethnically cleanse Jerusalem, it's not doing a very good job. This is a preposterous claim. It actually borders on a blood libel. There is absolutely no foundation for these claims. The Arab residents of Jerusalem are actually the largest Arab population in Israel. 20% of all of Israel's Arab population resides in Jerusalem. To say that the state of Israel is attempting to do anything of the kind it's a lie. It's just plain and simple, it's a lie. Now, in terms of families being evicted from their homes, I urge you to go onto the government of Finland's website and have a look at evictions and demolitions in Finland, or in Holland, or in Sweden, or in Ireland, or in the United Kingdom, or in any of the European countries that condemn Israel for demolitions and evictions, particularly Belgium, France. There are more evictions per capita in all of these European countries than there are in Israel. Governments often find it necessary to demolish illegal structures that are either unsafe or are disruptive to development plans. When things are built illegally, they have no right to stay where they are and often have to be demolished. When demolitions happen, that is, they happen in Israel as elsewhere, and even more particularly in Israel because of the international scrutiny, they happen after an incredibly lengthy legal process. And they don't just, the Israeli government doesn't simply decide on ethnic grounds where they're going to demolish things, except for some very unfortunate exceptions. And those exceptions are always against Jewish communities, where for political reasons, wholesale demolitions and evacuations have occurred for political reasons, as the Israeli government has attempted to seek some sort of peaceful resolution of conflicts with its neighbors. Unfortunately, that has not actually worked out very well. But in all cases where there are wholesale demolitions of this kind, it is Jews whose homes are demolished, with varying degrees of relocation or compensation. So I urge people to just simply get the facts, and those facts are available to anybody who wants to see them. Claiming that Israel demolishes or evicts Arabs from their homes is a very disingenuous statement. When people are evacuated from their homes or evicted from properties, it is because they are there illegally. And that is 100% of the time.
Yeah. Let me read another quote from her opinion. This is a quote. The seizure of Palestinian property in East Jerusalem is part of the occupation of the West Bank. Israel has taken over about 60% of the Palestinian territories and water resources in the West Bank, which has meant restriction the freedom of movement, assembly, and trade of nearly 3 million Palestinians. Highways leading from Israel to settlements have destroyed beautiful biblical landscapes, and Palestinians live besieged in their cities, end of quote. So many people claim that Israel doesn't grant building permissions to the Arabs and they do not have enough living space, so they have to build illegally in the Area C and in East Jerusalem. They claim that Israel is committing apartheid or ethnic cleansing by dismantling Arab homes in Area C and in East Jerusalem. So what about these claims of have to build illegally because getting no building permissions?
So there are quite a few really baseless claims that were raised here. The first thing I'd like to point out is by saying that Israel has taken over 60% of the West Bank, and the water resources, I would remind everyone that the current international framework, the law that is in force, is the result of an international treaty signed between Israel, witnessed by the European Union and its member states and the United States, in which the Palestinian Authority was created and Israel handed over jurisdiction of over 40% of these disputed territories to Palestinian control. Those are called areas A and B. Area C, the 60% remaining, remained under full Israeli jurisdiction. And this is where the conflicts arise, because in areas A and B, there are 0 Jews. No Jews allowed. No Jews are allowed to go there. No Jews are allowed to own there. No Jews are allowed to build there. No Jews are allowed to live there. So in area C, where there's a mixture, this is under full Israeli jurisdiction. But areas A and B, over 40% of the disputed territory, are under full Palestinian Authority jurisdiction. We simply wanted to find out how much truth there was to the claim that the Palestinians have nowhere else to build, and therefore they build illegally in Area C. So we purchased satellite images covering all of the West Bank, areas A, B, and C, and we mapped out exactly what area is built up, what area is still available, where there's room to build, and who's in charge. And we came to the conclusion that close to 70% of the available land reserves in areas A and B under full Palestinian Authority jurisdiction are empty. There's plenty of space. The Palestinian Authority also needs no Israeli permission to build there. But instead of building there, it takes all of the resources, and these are tremendous resources, funneled in by the European Union and European member states and non-government organizations and church groups and charities all over the world, uses all of those resources to build illegally for political reasons in Area C. Knowing full well that what they're doing is illegal, the European Union actually builds into its contracts with Palestinian contractors clauses that cover the costs of demolitions because they know that what they're building in Area C is illegal. So this is false. This is politically motivated. And essentially, despite what, for example, the Irish Parliament recently decided that the state of Israel has de facto annexed the West Bank in some way, the only annexation that's really happened down on the ground de facto has been carried out with European help by the Palestinian Authority, and it's in Area C. In the meantime, the life and standard of living and housing crisis and humanitarian crisis and water crisis and all of the other things for which the Palestinian Authority is responsible in areas A and B goes completely unaddressed and ignored. And all of those resources are being used to change the map and to wrest control out of the jurisdiction of Israel, which was decided by international treaty.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on the water resources thing, something more?
Water is a massive problem in the Middle East. It always has been. It is what makes or breaks the viability of existence in this part of the world. Water resources are crucial. The Palestinian Authority has full access to all the water resources in 40% of Judea and Samaria. In addition, the state of Israel has come to agreements with former enemies in which it gives massive water resources to Jordan, to Egypt, to all the countries with which it has made peace treaties. Part of that issue is water. So if the Palestinian Authority were so concerned about sustainability and water, it would actually encourage construction and development according to some logical plan, and not simply encourage impossible construction inside nature reserves, in desert areas, in ecosystems that cannot sustain life without completely upsetting natural balance. That's why we have planning authorities. That's why we issue building permits. That's what governments are responsible to do. And the Palestinian Authority has no interest in doing any of that or in protecting any of the other natural resources that are under its jurisdiction, including air quality, pollution, waste treatment. We have massive problem because those issues are being completely ignored by the Palestinian Authority. And we all breathe the same air. We all drink the same water. So again, I encourage people to have a look at the map and see how close these areas are to one another. Judea and Samaria is literally in the heart of the state of Israel. The resources are shared. We have no choice. There has to be some sort of logical use, a sustainable use of our resources. And for that, we have government and we have treaties and we have planning. We encourage the Palestinian Authority to do precisely those things in the areas under its jurisdiction.
Yeah. Well, there are also some claims that Israel keeps Palestinians in slum-like suburbs in East Jerusalem, where it doesn't provide infrastructure like water, waste collection, roads, schools, etc. I've also seen those slums like Issawiya. So can you tell what is the situation? Why do these underserved communities exist?
They exist because the Palestinian Authority creates them. There are neighborhoods of Jerusalem that are under Palestinian Authority jurisdiction. For example, Issawiya, Al-Azariya. Abu Dis, for example, was a Jerusalem neighborhood that was ceded in its entirety from Area C, from Israeli control, and is now essentially Area A, where the state of Israel cannot go and does not go. The Palestinian Authority is responsible for waste treatment, for sewage, for schools, for health clinics, for transportation, for infrastructure in all of these areas, and provides none. In addition to all of that, for example, in Issawiya, the Palestinian Authority incentivizes Arabs from areas A and B to move in to these Jerusalem neighborhoods with no planning and no possible sustainability. It's building and encouraging construction of impossible situations there with no supporting infrastructure in order to change the demographic balance. At the moment, the Arab residents of these Jerusalem neighborhoods have a political status of residents of Israel. They were offered citizenship. They refused to take citizenship by Israel. And therefore, they have a special status, which allows them to vote in municipal elections. But under Palestinian Authority pressure, they do not do so. The Palestinian Authority has spent years and tremendous resources incentivizing Arabs from areas A and B to move into these neighborhoods so that when the time comes, they can very, very easily take advantage of this massive demographic shift in favor of the Arab population, no ethnic cleansing, the Arab population, which is growing at a very, very rapid rate, and encourage people to lift the ban on participating in Israeli elections and simply take control of the municipality. So this is one of the ways that the democracy in Israel has to learn how to protect itself. Unfortunately, democracies are very, very, very bad at protecting themselves because they are more interested in individual rights. They very, very often tend to ignore national rights. And so we have a situation where something's going to have to be done to address this problem. Nothing's being done to address this problem at the moment, but the situation in some of these Arab neighborhoods, yes, they are underserved because the Palestinian Authority does not serve them. They are there to serve the Palestinian Authority and not vice versa, again, for political purposes.
I've seen many times, like volunteers from Finland or from Western countries taken to these areas and shown how badly Israel is treating Palestinians in Jerusalem. So there is what they see and the narrative, what they hear, and they mix them together as a fact, which they are not actually.
They are not.
Well, I would like to ask about this thing, which comes also when one discusses about these things, which is that some people claim that while Israel gives right to reclaim the ownership in the areas previously illegally occupied by Jordan, it should also maintain the ownership in Israel proper, and that after the 1967 war, any land or structure owned by Arabs before the establishment of the State of Israel should be given back to the previous Arab owners. So there is in Israel an absentee land law, which people say is discriminating against the Arabs. Can you explain a little bit this law and how Israel treats the property of the Palestinian refugees left behind in 1948?
So yeah, obviously this is a very complex legal issue, but the results speak for themselves. In Israel, of the 7% of the total land mass of Israel that is privately owned, a disproportionate amount of it is actually owned by Israeli Arabs. Although the Israeli Arabs constitute they are represented in terms of land ownership double their percentage in the general population. And how did that happen? Because when Israel was established in 1948, they simply opened the books and said, anyone with title, deed, proof of ownership to a piece of land in this country, come and register, and we will give you an Israeli title to the land. And that's exactly what happened. So Arab and land ownership in northern Israel is disproportionately high to their representation in the general population, double as a matter of fact, because they came with Ottoman land deeds, Turkish land deeds, and proved their ownership, and they were registered as owners of the land. So they own land to a much higher extent, to a much higher percentage than Israeli landowners. On the other hand, when the custodian for abandoned enemy property took over from the Jordanian custodian, which had actually taken over from the British mandatory custodian, what happened was, strangely, even though Jewish owners could prove that they had ownership predating the establishment of the state, predating the Jordanian occupation, the state of Israel has chosen in most cases not to return those properties, but to continue to administer them as in custodianship. On the other hand, the state of Israel passed a law in the aftermath of the 1967 war, recognizing all transfer of titles carried out by the Jordanian custodian. Even though Jordanian occupation was illegal under international law and was never recognized other than by two countries, was condemned internationally, the state of Israel took a decision and was passed into law, ratified in 1970. The law took about a year and a half to go through the legislative process after the 1967 war, and was ratified. And that is that the state of Israel recognizes all transfer of title that was carried out by the illegal Jordanian regime in these territories. So there's no discrimination involved here. There's a very, very selective method of reporting what the actual reality on the ground is. But anybody who's really interested in educating themselves, I'll be happy to send links to the laws themselves. Very, very often they're not translated, but you can get the gist of it from a Google Translate kind of thing, or I'll be happy to translate if you don't rely on my translation. There are plenty of other translators out there, but on the books, Israeli law recognizes transfer of title carried out by the Jordanians. Any legal documentation of land ownership is honored by the state of Israel. We have the same situation in the north of Israel with Israeli Arabs. We have the same situation where the state of Israel gave Bedouin claimants over a decade to present proof of ownership so that they could have title registered in their names in the Negev. We have the same thing in Jerusalem. We have the same thing throughout Israel. And there is no discrimination in land and property law in this country.
Yeah, I can actually add the links down below this video when I publish it. So if you send me links, I will.
Happy to send.
Yeah. So, and lastly, I would like to read one more claim from this opinion by the professor of Tampere University. And this is a quote: "According to international agreements, the occupier must not change the population base or infrastructure of the area." End of quote. What do the international agreements actually say about population transfer and infrastructure in occupied territories? And has Israel acted against the international law? Because it seems to me that many people are inventing international law or misinterpreting it. And critics of Israel like to give the impression that international law forbids somehow Jews from residing in any lands claimed as part of the so-called occupied Palestinian territories. But does the claim have actually any foundation in international law?
The short answer is no, it has no claim. The much longer answer is much more complex, obviously. There are several things that you need to know about international law. First and foremost, whether or not there is such a thing as international law. And second of all, whether or not the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is what is always cited when discussing this question, whether or not it even applies to the situation of Israel in Judea and Samaria. The Israeli government contends, has always contended and continues to contend. And I cannot understand why it doesn't contend more loudly. However, the State of Israel contends that the Fourth Geneva Convention does not apply to these areas because, first of all, Israel is not an occupier. Under international law, an occupier would be a country that has taken from a different sovereign control through hostile activity of a piece of land previously administered by another sovereign. Now, the State of Israel has not done that in the case of Judea and Samaria. May surprise some of your viewers to hear that there was never any such thing as Palestine. Israel never took anything from Palestine. Calling these areas occupied Palestinian territory is a misnomer under international law because Palestine was never a sovereign. It never existed as a political entity, and it still does not. So we did not take it from Palestine, nor did we take it from Jordan, because Jordan was an illegal occupier. The last possible sovereign who was in control of these areas was the Ottoman Empire, which no longer exists. Under the international agreements that are in the founding charter of the United Nations, the League of Nations, starting in the 1920s, all of this territory was slated for a Jewish homeland. When Jordan was created as an independent state, that was the first two-state solution that was supposed to resolve the question of Palestinian national aspirations in the land slated to be a Jewish national homeland. So the State of Israel ceded 80% of the territory originally stated for Israel, created the first two-state solution. That didn't stop the bloodshed. So in 1947, the United Nations suggested again partitioning the remaining 20%, the UN Partition Plan of 1917. Once again, the Arabs rejected that. That didn't stop the bloodshed. So under the Oslo Accords, the State of Israel attempted once again to create some sort of land sharing arrangement, not necessarily statehood on both sides, but some sort of sharing of jurisdiction to stop the bloodshed. Once again, that has not stopped the bloodshed and has not solved the problem. So going back to your original question, because I've digressed, whether or not the Geneva Conventions apply here. The State of Israel, in the aftermath of the 1967 war, decided of its own volition on a temporary basis to apply certain rules of the Geneva Conventions to the people living in the territory that it had repatriated as a result of the war. In order to allow for a resolution, a negotiated resolution. As we know, that has not happened yet. However, that involves the treatment of the population, not necessarily the treatment of the territory itself. Now, in terms of the claim that the occupying power, which we are not, is forbidden from doing certain things to the territory or the population, those both are misinterpreted and misconstrued in the quote that you read. For example, the occupying power, even if you were considering Israel an occupier, not only can, but must, is required to create favorable living conditions for the population in the territory. That means creation of infrastructure, roads, water resources, electricity, transportation. All of these things are the responsibility of an occupying power. And that's why the occupying power is required to consider all requests for changes on the ground and to issue permits. That's number one. Number two, the much larger question of whether or not an occupying power is allowed to create changes in demography. what the Geneva Conventions were designed to address was the problem that completely redrew the map of Europe in the aftermath of the Second World War, and that was forced transfer of mass transfer of populations for political reasons. That means removing people by force or resettling people by force in occupied territory. I would also add that those Geneva Conventions only apply within the first, I believe, year and a half after the end of an armed conflict. So they would have stopped applying in 1969. But even if we say that those Geneva Conventions are still in force, they have nothing to do with Israelis, Jews, voluntarily moving into that territory of their own volition and creating new communities. It's just simply not addressed in those Geneva Conventions. This situation doesn't exist anywhere else in terms of trying to apply the Geneva Conventions of occupation and treatment of unoccupied population to a population that has repatriated land originally slated for it under international agreement and moving there voluntarily to create new communities. So it's completely irrelevant. Unfortunately, over and over and over again, you will hear people repeating these mantras of how Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria are illegal. This is simply not true.
Yeah, one could also see some kind of racial discrimination in that Arabs can live in Israel, but Jews cannot live in those lands, or shouldn't by some people, and they are in danger in areas which are under the jurisdiction of Palestinian Authority.
I would point out that people don't really think about this. Every once in a while, the absurdity strikes me that the only country in the world that was created with part of its constitution specifically singling out Jews for racial discrimination was Jordan. When it was created on land set aside for the Jewish homeland, part of its founding charter was the stipulation that it is illegal and punishable by death to sell land to Jews in what is now Jordan, and that carries over into Judea and Samaria. The Palestinian Authority continues to enforce that rule and actually does assassinate people who are accused of selling land to Jews. This is the only place in the world that the international community doesn't seem to find it at all disturbing that this kind of racial discrimination exists in terms of basic rights. And it is one-sided completely. Only Jews are prohibited from owning or purchasing property anywhere in the world, and that's here.
I really want to thank you, Naomi, for your time, for your expertise, for your willingness to explain these things. So
my pleasure. If anyone has any questions or would like to see any of the documentation or maps, any of our studies, you can see them all on our website. It's very, very easy to find, regavim.org. And we try to share as much real, solid, factual information as we can. But if there are other questions that I haven't addressed, or people want more detail or more resources, I'm happy to provide whatever I can find or point them in the right direction. I can be reached either through our website. Anything that comes in English comes directly to me, or directly to my email, naomi@regavim.org. I'm available pretty much all the time.